everyone. Thank you for being here and for being here so early. Congratulations on making it to your final day. I wanted to start by asking or putting up a question or two. I'm going to guess that you've probably encountered these questions from students before, but I wanted to check. Have your students ever asked you, why do I need to know this? When am I ever going to use this? I think we typically answer them by saying something on the order of, when you're older, you'll understand, or you'll definitely use this if you apply for this job, or when you study this field, or you go into this major. That content will be really useful for you. So learn it away, use that knowledge. And for the most part, I think that's true. We teach the content we teach for a reason. We suspect that that will be useful for our students' futures, for everything that they'll do that comes down the line. But we're not positive, and I think every once in a while, there is the possibility that we're teaching the content, the knowledge, without a whole bunch of contextualization. And so that's important. That's a big piece of it. Sometimes we think about that also as, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with a concept of just-in-time versus just-in-case learning. So do we teach our students learning just in case they'll use that one day in the future? Or are they learning things just in time for using it tomorrow or right away? I think we do really want to make sure that our students are learning things that matter to them, that aren't necessarily things that might matter to them in the future, but really matter to them now. There are some educational researchers who focus a lot on assessment, who say that the learning that matters is the learning that's used. This comes out of a long catalog of books and work around documenting and assessing learning in informal and media-rich environments, but that totally connects to formal school environments as well. I think that's true, right? Another way of thinking about this is to HQ, PBL, and all the principles and processes behind it is that we really want learning to be relevant, and we want it to be authentic, and that matters. I think, I would put out there, are in the business of creating quality learning experiences. I laugh at that a little bit because business is a word. We might not be making a ton of money with it, but we are in the business of creating really quality learning experiences. And we think about that in terms, I often talk a lot about connecting formal and informal environments, connecting formal and informal education. And I usually talk about that in bridging the two because there's so much good work that happens in museums and libraries and after-school programs, at community-based organizations in the neighborhood, and any sort of out-of-school time setting. And that doesn't always connect to the really fantastic things that are happening within the four school walls and vice versa, but there's such value in being able to show what each entity does and to really cross and connect the two. Another way of thinking, though, about bridging formal and informal education is really connecting school to life and vice versa. And that seems pretty obvious. Maybe it's too simple or almost too simplistic, but ultimately that is the point. We really want to make sure that what happens in school is relevant for our students' lives and vice versa, and for ourselves as teachers as well. My work with teachers, some of the best work, I get to work with teachers day in and day out, and some of the best learning experiences that I've seen they create have that innate link between school and life and vice versa, and that helps them never have to deal with those questions. Why do I need to learn this? How am I ever going to use this in the future? In making, we use things related to a lot of different materials, and we hope that things like this are seen both inside and outside the classroom. And ultimately, these are toys and materials that not you, but our youth really play with when they first start out. And to see the linkages and the connections that they can make from early childhood all the way throughout their experience in schooling is also a really important piece. Some of those foundational Lego bricks and blocks really do connect throughout their course of learning. A couple years ago, I worked with a student who was a young teen. He lives in East San Jose. He's the oldest of 4 children. His parents are Vietnamese immigrants, and he was trying to find his place in school. He had a really deep interest and passion for music, but didn't get to really play around with that idea much at school. And as he was saving his money and building up his bank account, he really wanted to be able to purchase a guitar, and specifically an electric guitar. So as he was doing his research, looking at things at Guitar Center and on Craigslist and figuring out what was available to him and understanding, how much money do I actually need to save for this, he realized a couple of things. One being that and I don't know much about guitars, but as you advance your skills, a beginner guitar works with beginner skills. But after you're a beginner and you advance, you need an intermediate type guitar for an intermediate learner, an advanced guitar for an advanced musician. And they don't translate necessarily from one to another. You just have to buy a new one each time. You can sell your old one, but you have to get a new one. And he was like, I don't have enough money for that. There's no way I'm ever going to save up enough to buy 3 guitars or 4 guitars. I want to start out with one that I can kind of use forever and learn on and continue forth with. So he said, well, what am I going to do? How am I going to do this? Why isn't there anything that exists that allows me to do so that I don't have to purchase guitar after guitar after guitar? I'm never going to convince my parents that that's a good idea. And if my 3 siblings aren't going to play with guitars, that's not going to be a useful investment either. So he proposed an idea to a science teacher whom he was close with. He didn't have music class at school. And he said, is there any way that we can make a guitar? I have this idea where we can make a guitar, but you can swap out the components. So as you advance in your skills, those key components can be swapped out and changed up as well. The science teacher was like, sure, I don't know, I'm not really sure, maybe that's a possibility. Why don't you dive into it and see? So he dug into it, he learned about all the different components that a guitar usually includes, what it means to advance in skills, what those components might look like if they're advanced versus beginner. And he worked with his science teacher, and his science teacher reached out to other teachers. Those teachers reached out to teachers in other schools. Those teachers in other schools reached out to community members, and they were able to gather together an opportunity for this particular young teen to learn how to design, to do CNC design. He learned how to use a laser cutter. He investigated materials of wood and plastic and fiberboard, and he was able to create his very own modular guitar. This took the course of a year and a half. This was something he did sometimes after school, sometimes as part of school assignments. And he was able to show off his modular guitar at a maker fair one year. He got a red ribbon. He spent 2 full days at the maker fair in San Mateo in the Bay Area, showing off his modular guitar, answering questions, telling people about what it looked like, what it was for. He demonstrated, he plugged it in. This was prototype number 4. There were still things he was working on. He had ideas for the future. He wasn't going to sell anything because this was his. He was like, later on down the line, maybe check back with me in 10 years. Maybe I'll have a business then. But it was phenomenal, and it showed the power of him having an idea and being able to follow through on it with the support of his community, of his teachers, of the tools and materials available or not available to him to really push that through. And I thought that was phenomenal because ultimately this learning was super relevant to his life. It was authentic to his interests, his passions, his purpose. It was perfect for what he needed. 3 years ago, I worked with a teacher. She is an incredible math teacher at the high school level. Her name is Rachel. She's worked both in the classroom for a couple of decades, but also as an instructional coach for math at her district. And she was going back to the classroom at this point in time a couple years back. And she was tasked with teaching remedial algebra to juniors and seniors. And she said, oh man, okay, I'm ready for this. I will get into it. Her classroom was in a portable, and she had 14, I believe, remedial algebra students that year. And as she sat them down on day 1, she thought, hey, we have this habit in remedial math classes of just kind of repeating the same thing again. They didn't get it the first time, but we're going to repeat it and hope that they get it this time, maybe at a slower pace. Maybe it's even more boring, but this is remedial algebra, this is what we're going to do. And she realized that's really not going to be the best approach. It's not relevant to what they're interested in. They don't really get the numbers and the letters as part of what algebra is all about. They don't see its application. I can't use my excuse that maybe they're going to learn it in the future or use it in the future, or maybe it's going to be a field because they don't care. I need to really get them in some way. And so she looked around her portable classroom and thought, my portable it's kind of plain. On one side is some whiteboards. The other 3 walls are beige. I've put up some posters of movies that are exciting. I've put up some motivational quotes, things like that. But what if I asked my students what they wanted to do this semester and asked them if they wanted to improve their space? Because ultimately, that classroom was a little bit plain. And they agreed. She said, so it's all yours. You guys decide, what do you want to do to improve our classroom this year? What kind of legacy are you going to leave for the next set of math students that come through this portable in my class? And they got together, 14 students brainstormed, they talked with one another, they learned how to work together and come up with ideas. They agreed on a final idea, which is that they wanted to install whiteboards around all 4 walls of the classroom and some pegboards as well, because they're like, oh, maybe we can bring some tools in, we'll play around with it. So these high school juniors and seniors went at it. And Rachel said, okay, that's a great idea. I will get district approval. We'll figure out what a possible budget might be. And you guys go at it. Let's figure out how to install whiteboards and pegboards in all 4 walls of our classroom. So they went at it. They brought out rulers and tape measures, and they measured. They measured twice. They measured 3 times. Groups of students each measured and found that they didn't have the same measurements, so they measured again. They realized that the height of one wall was different than the height of another. They realized that the 2 walls don't meet at perfect right angles. They're like, what does this mean? How am I going to interpret this? They created equations in their head that they didn't even realize were equations. And then the next step, once they had their numbers, was that Rachel took them on a field trip to the local hardware store. A lot of them had been to the hardware store before. Some of them had never been before. And they learned about how supplies come at the hardware store. They needed to buy furring strips. They needed to buy 2x4s. At the hardware store, you can usually find shower board, which is basically like thin whiteboard, in 4-foot by 8-foot sheets. 2x4s come in 8, 10, 12-foot lengths. They had to really connect and translate their measurements that didn't necessarily make a lot of sense to what they could purchase and fit in their car or the bus at the local hardware store. I spent a couple hours at the hardware store on this field trip. You can see them kind of debating and figuring out what to buy. They had a budget they needed to abide by. They had to figure out, do I want more pegboard? Do I want more whiteboard? If I buy whiteboard, there's dry erase markers we have to purchase. There was math super embedded in all of this, and Rachel was delighted. The work actually ended up taking a little bit longer than she suspected, as a lot of really good projects do. But she was awesome. It was awesome. And she was there to support, to facilitate, to help them troubleshoot, to answer questions. She framed a lot of their challenges for them. She unveiled the math to them. They talked out loud about their thinking and their equations in their head, and she wrote them down. And that concrete became abstract, and that abstract became concrete, and it started to really make sense. And ultimately, I don't have a picture of it. Ultimately, they did. They created a lovely classroom with 4 walls of whiteboard and pegboard. They were able to use that. They were able to practice their equations. Everybody had a spot on the whiteboard to practice equations on. And they learned a lot about the applicability, really, of algebra, which is often really difficult to understand. They learned how algebra and geometry really begin to connect as well. And remedial algebra became not necessarily just another repeated, boring class, but an opportunity to connect their school experience with their life. One of the programs that Maker Ed runs, I'll talk a little bit about Maker Ed in just a second. One of the programs that Maker Ed runs is called Maker Vista. It's in partnership with AmeriCorps Vista, which is a federally run program by a tiny agency called the Corporation for National and Community Service. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with AmeriCorps, or the idea of national service. Vista in itself is really unique and really interesting because its goal is to overcome poverty. And there are many pathways through which multiple Vista programs do so. Our Maker Vista program proposes that we are going to work on overcoming poverty through maker education or maker-centered learning. So we work with educational partner sites all over the country, a handful of them, most of them schools, some of them educational institutions and nonprofits near schools that work with schools. And we have Vista members or Vista volunteers who commit 365 days to service at that school. They work behind the scenes. Their job, full-time, 40 hours a week, is to show up at that space. They are provided with a minimal stipend that is based off of the poverty level of the community that they're working in. And they work behind the scenes on anything and everything related to building the capacity of that organization or that school to be able to offer more educational opportunities to its community. It is access and equity in your face, but in beautiful, truthful, translated, really respectful ways. And it really is promoting education as that opportunity. We work in a lot of different communities. They're all phenomenal in their own ways. One particular site in Atlanta is super fun and super unique. They have a PBL and maker-based model around which their K through 12 grades are centered. And one semester, the project that you see up here is a collaboration between their 10th and 11th grade engineering students and their 3rd grade engineering students. And the task was for them to understand what a book desert meant in their area in Atlanta. They noted that there was often not a lot of access to books in certain neighborhoods, and that meant that the opportunity for developing literacy was a little bit limited in certain areas, whereas some of us have easy access to bookstores and libraries to borrow and read and access the services of the library. Other communities don't. And so they thought, okay, what can we do to alleviate this problem? What is it like to provide more book access? What does that mean? We don't necessarily want to drive a mobile bookstore around. That takes a lot of time and effort and money and a car and gas and things like that. So what can we do? So they researched both the 10th and 11th graders and the 3rd graders and came up with an idea. And their idea was, we're going to create little free libraries for a whole bunch of our neighborhoods. So if you're not familiar with little free libraries, you should look it up, it's great. They are basically birdhouse-sized houses, often wood. They're posted, they're attached to a post, and they're often staked in a couple of front yards of neighborhoods. You can open the door of the little free library, and there's anywhere from like 5 to 20 books there. And anybody passing by can grab one, borrow it, read it, take it home with them, and at some point in time, return it or replace it. So it's ultimately like a library in your neighborhood. And they said, we're going to do this. So together, throughout the course of the semester, the 10th and 11th graders and 3rd graders modified designs, they put together a plan, and they built little free libraries. They measured, they learned how to use clamps, wood glue, they tried to figure out what are things that work for 3rd graders as well as 10th and 11th graders. They were safe, they had safety glasses on. They worked through class periods. This was part of multiple assignments and tasks. They had support from the community and community volunteers. And then midway through their semester, too, Atlanta had a maker fair that they had an opportunity to take a part of. And so they brought their project to Maker Faire. It wasn't done. It was still in progress. They were still fixing a couple things, iterating on a couple of designs. That first little free library didn't work as well as they had planned. But they brought it to the Maker Faire and showed it off to the visitors and attendees there. Hey, this is what we're doing. Come get involved if you want. Help us build right here and right now. So they did. So students from this school engaged Maker Faire visitors from all over to help them build little free libraries. And this was phenomenal, and another really, really fantastic story of really engaging life in school in ways that we don't always see. And not only life in school, but life in school in their community. The work that a lot of our Maker Vista sites do reflects the cultural, the traditional, and the historical traditions of what they care about, what they know, what they're good at. And this was fantastic. One last story I want to tell you about is more at a school level, which kind of mixes in a little bit. And I think it's super interesting because when we think about creating quality learning experiences or really good opportunities for our students to engage, we do also think about the space and the environment that they're in. This is a library media center, very much renovated as part of a capital campaign 4 or 5 years ago at a large public comprehensive high school in Virginia. When they first started this, they said, hey, our library media center is just stacks of books. Students kind of use it, they kind of don't. It's this big space that takes up a lot of square footage in our school, but it's not actively used, there's not really efficient use of it. Our librarians are awesome, and they could do more, and they want to do more, and they want to work with teachers and students even more, so let's see what we can do. So they blasted through a few walls, they gutted some areas, they created some spaces where students could gather. They took out a few stacks of books, so they decreased their book inventory a little bit. They have a small music studio. They have an area where you can engage hands-on with materials, Legos, cardboard, hot glue, things like that. They have a general open seating area. They have a Genius bar that is manned by students for students, kind of like in your Apple store. Those students are there on their free periods, on their lunch break. They support technical things, technological things. They work with the IT guy. And they also support things completely unrelated to technology and Apple products as well. This space is really interesting for, I think, lots of reasons, but one in particular. When I visited a few years back, I noticed that their assistant principal, their vice principal, stood at the front of school every morning with a roll of raffle tickets under his arm. And he handed out tickets to students as they passed by before the first bell. And he had a limited number of tickets, and he did this every morning. And we were like, what are you doing? Do you host raffles every day? Like, what prizes are you giving away? He's like, no. Those raffle tickets allow students to enter the Learning Commons, the Library Media Center, during their lunch hours, during their free periods, during that lunch block. He was like, and the reason that we hand out tickets, not raffle tickets, just tickets, is so that we can abide by fire code. And I was like, what? So their problem is that they have so many students that want to be there at the same time. They have to make sure that the students are safe and they're not going beyond their max number that are allowed there, which is a phenomenal problem to have, really. And what's neat is that you see all sorts of students. I think high school is often known for their cliques, but you see all sorts of students here all the time engaging with one another, learning from one another. The music studio students are working with the students who are reading, who are working with the students who are working on a project together. And it's really neat. And it also really speaks to understanding the needs of your students and connecting their needs to the offerings of the school. I talk about all of this because one of the things that we do at Maker Ed is think about the design of learning opportunities and spaces. And we think that the design of any learning opportunity must recognize and celebrate a learner's ability to experience, influence his or her world. I think we can probably all agree on this sort of thing. And the way that we do it is through making and maker education. At Maker Ed, we're based in Oakland. We're a small nonprofit, and we work with educators like yourselves and institutions all over the nation to help them think about how to integrate making in a really deep, thoughtful, and useful way. That might be into existing lesson plans, that might be an after-school club, it might be thinking about a maker space, it might be converting something, but really, ultimately, this is the point. And I put this out there because a lot of you might be familiar with making in some form or fashion. I think the thing that's most obvious is that there are maker fairs all around the globe. Some of them really reflect the character and personalities of the communities they're in, some of them are a little bit bigger. And making has a reputation for being sometimes all about tools and materials and equipment. It's all about 3D printing and laser cutting. I would propose to say that that's not entirely true. Tools and materials are part of it, but it is also, as we talk about generally in education, making is a vehicle for learning and teaching. It's a great way about thinking about how to engage students, where they're at. It's great for making learning relevant to who they are. Will it fix our STEM crisis? I don't know. Maybe it will. Potentially it will. If students who engage in maker-centered learning and maker-centered experiences have an interest in STEM careers later on down the line, that's phenomenal. That's great. But if they're just better, engaged, informed citizens who can contribute to the world, who can problem solve, who are excited and have the confidence to be creative, that's even better. Making really ultimately is about the people involved. It's about how they use the tools. It's about how they engage with one another. We often talk about how the maker movement shares a lot, and I know educators share a lot too. And so it's really neat to see that intersection of making and learning grow and evolve to really consider how this works in schools. We see this a lot, which is really fun. It's not just about 3D printers and laser cutters. It's about the opportunities for kids to work together that might not have worked together before. It's very much about introducing skills and tools from long ago. It's about building upon the foundation of pedagogies, philosophies, of teachers, leaders, and researchers from the past. And we see a lot of connections ultimately for all subject areas, grade levels, all sorts of methodologies and approaches in education. It is also about the know-how. We talk a lot about knowledge, but really it's what you do with that knowledge. How do you use it? How does it apply to your next learning experience or your next challenge? And part of that too is know who. Both of these terms come also from a group of researchers who think about learning assessments. And the know who is not just about who you know, but what they bring to the table, how you work with them, what sorts of talents and strengths and quirks they have, and really reflecting upon your own as well. And those are the foundations, ultimately, of what a lot of our high-quality learning experiences are about. And I know what all of you have been kind of digesting and learning and soaking in throughout the course of the past 3 or 4 days. So I put this out to you, that as you take all of this information back from the wonderful workshops and institutes that Buck Institute has led over the course of this conference, as you keep in touch with the new friends that you've made and the colleagues that you've been here with, as you think about what is the project that I'm going to implement in my school, in my classroom, I want to put out to you and invite you to consider that we have the opportunity to create high-quality learning experiences and environments where students will never, ever have to ask us again these questions. Thank you.